what do you think the greatest innovations of human beings are? What have been the greatest innovations of the last 100 years, the last 500 years, 1,000 years? Someone shout out one. Louder. Language, the internet, healthcare. Okay, good. What was it? The printing press. Good. So, the way I look at this read of history, a lot of the things you guys talked about are actually the result, like the internet, of a first innovation I'm going to talk about. And that is how we understand the world. Before the 1600s, how did we know how the world worked? The church and philosophers, in fact, they were called philosophers, told us how the world worked. Until a guy named Galileo comes around and he says, if we want to understand the world, maybe we should interrogate the world directly. And what Galileo did was an incredible experiment that is, no one knows if it's actually true or not, but he went up and he said, let me test whether objects fall at the same rate. Aristotle, none other than Aristotle, had said, obviously, heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Seems intuitive to me now, right? Think about it. A heavier object feels like it falls faster. Galileo said, let me devise an experiment. And he goes up the Tower of Pisa, and he drops 2 balls over multiple tries, metal ball, wooden ball, does a whole bunch of other experiments, and disproves Aristotle. Later on, in the end of his career, Galileo got in trouble with the church because he disagreed with the geocentric model of the world. The church said, obviously the earth is the center of the world because God made it, and God made us at the center, and we should be at the center. And Galileo said, well, what does the evidence show? And came to the conclusion that we don't live in a geocentric world. In fact, the sun is the center of the world. So not only did Galileo give us fundamental understandings about gravity and fundamental forces in the world, he gave us the scientific method. Sadly, Galileo was brought up on the Inquisition and put under house arrest for the last 5 years of his life. He was under house arrest and died in Italy, in Pisa. Well, the work was taken up in the 1660s by Sir Christopher Wren and a whole bunch of folks, 12 of them, in London. And they said, why don't we have a society that will practice experimental philosophy? So they did. And then the newly restored monarch was actually Charles II. They said, why don't we get a royal decree and have the monarch make us a royal society? And so they were. And the Royal Society still works today. But what the Royal Society then did was complete the scientific method. So what is a scientific method, right? Observe, hypothesize, experiment, test, see what happens from the experiment. That was Galileo's contribution. The Royal Society said, oh, we also have to reproduce the result and publish that in a journal and review the result. In fact, they made the world's first academic journal. What happens after the scientific method gets formalized is human knowledge goes exponential. We start uncovering the laws of gravity, the laws of electromagnetism, small and weak nuclear forces. And the scientific method applied millions and millions of times produces all kinds of incredible knowledge and understanding of the world around us. So this is the first big transformation from authority-based phenomena or understanding the world to a process that replaces the authority. If you have a crazy idea about how the world works, great. That's your hypothesis. Now we need an experiment to decide whether your hypothesis is true or not. First house, the house of phenomena. The second house, the house of rights. How do we get our rights? How did we get our rights for thousands of years? The king or the queen decided our rights. They could take away our rights at any given moment. They could give us our rights. It was something we didn't have control over. The story fast forwards to the late 1700s, and a bunch of folks, all men it turns out, decide we don't want a king. How do we do not king? Yeah, we got an interesting story going on today, right? So how do we do not king? Well, they said, well, let's design a process for this. So what do? They came up with something called, what was it? Natural rights? No. When America was founded, they had, what was the launching document? Not the Bill of Rights. The Constitution? Okay, wait, that's good. Some historians in the audience, but the Constitution was actually 2.0. Magna Carta, are you going all the way back to 1052? No. The Articles of Confederation, excellent. The historians in the audience are going to save us from ourselves. What happened to the Articles of Confederation? They didn't work. 10 years into the grand experiment of America, the whole thing was falling apart. And at this point, many people went back to Washington and said, would you please be king? We're independent. Monarchy seems to be the only thing that works for this rights thing, and we just tried this experiment. It didn't work. The great man that he was, he said, nope, I didn't fight this to be king. Keep working the problem. And James Madison and a number of other folks said, I think I figured this out. So they went back to Philadelphia, and they brought back the king in the form of the executive branch. Step one was actually established in the Articles of Confederation, the legislature, legislate. Step two now was established in the Constitution, execute. But as we all know, the design isn't complete yet, is it? What's the third step in the process? Judicial. The judicial shows up in 1803. What? Doesn't the Constitution say Article 1, Article 2, Article 3? Yes. But it didn't give the court the right of review. Remember the review process the Royal Society put on the scientific method? In a court case, Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall, the judge, says, hey, by the way, you didn't give us this right. We have this right to decide what is and isn't constitutional. And all the framers went, oh, yeah, good, thanks for that. Awesome. So America 2.1.10. Someone said Bill of Rights, you're right, 10 amendments. Two major revisions, articles to Constitution, and then point one, judiciary, which, by the way, no one ever bothered to correct the Constitution or amend the Constitution. So it became a practice. But now the process was complete. And in fact, the process actually has 4 steps, right? It isn't legislate, execute, review. What's the first step? Someone said the Declaration. What is that? A protest. A protest. If you see a right that's missing, you have to protest it in some form or fashion. So once we had the process, then others could use the process, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848, and writes the Declaration of Sentiments. And 70 long years later, women finally had the right to vote. And as we've gotten better at using this process of rights, we've gotten better and we use it faster. And so gay rights took 30 years. But once you have a process, now this process displaces the authority of the king. Innovation number 2. Okay, we're building up our human fugue, our 4 houses. There are 4 of these. What could be the 3rd house? So if we understand the world, and we're understanding the world, now we have a process for rights. What's the 3rd thing we got to figure out in our journey? Resources. How do we get our stuff? How do I get my food, my shelter, my clothing, right? Well, at that time, people thought the state had to control. The king or the state had to decide and create the resources. But then here comes Adam Smith and a bunch of his friends, and in 1776 writes The Wealth of Nations and says, no, 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 we can have this process of free exchange, where people can find out what's needed, create a product, a good service, exchange that with each other, and as they do that, we can solve the resource needs that we have. Phenomena, Pisa and London, rights, Philadelphia, resources, Edinburgh and, say, New York City, right? Hamilton. Hamilton's having his day. Steward of the 3rd house. So we got these 3 houses, and in fact, when you look around the world, there's only about 15 countries in the world, or so, that run their societies on these 3 processes. It's an astonishingly small number of countries. Most countries are in some kind of transition between one of their houses. from authority to process. Some have gone right back. Russia went right back to the Tsar. It's difficult to live inside of a process. But the human fugue, it's not done yet. It turns out, welcome to the city where the fourth house is being worked out. Austin, Texas. The fourth house is the house of meaning. What's our process for meaning? We don't have one yet. But Austin is the place, or a place, where we steward each other's meaning on a daily basis. We show up for each other and we hold space for each other to discover what our unique meaning is. Whether on your spiritual journey, whether on your gender journey, whether on your sexuality, your work, relationships, how do you do you? How do you be yourself? That is the question that Austin asks and Austin practices on a daily basis. How do we do that? There's an amazing thing called experiences. We're in one right now. An experience causes you to reflect and be exposed to new ideas, new thoughts, new models of how to do things. From those experiences, if you like that experience, you love two-stepping at the Continental Club, guess what? You're going to find a community. And communities are the workhorses where people work out their meaning. This is where they exchange their journey capital with each other. We don't exchange money as we do in a market. That's what we do in markets. But in a community, we exchanged our journey with each other, our knowledge, our skills, our relationships, our insights. And from those communities, we end up with scenes. So what we are doing in Austin is an incredibly important work. We're actually figuring out how we do this fourth thing called meaning. Because meaning isn't phenomena. Meaning isn't rights. Meaning isn't resources. It's actually a totally separate thing. And it's no accident that meaning starts with two letters, M and E. It's all about you. Thanks.